We go. And we are back. We're back. I'm home. Oh, my bad. Alright, guys.
Studio and dash Lockheed Martin registered. AirVenture 2021 opener. AirVenture 2021 opener.
It's for the video done at AirVenture 2021.
Button play seek slider slide button play left parent. K right seek slider 0 minutes 3 seconds of 6 minutes fifth button play left parent.
It's
K
only
right
6 minutes, so it's not that long. Let's listen to it and then we'll talk about it. Ready? Here we go now.
Pause left parent.
Hey everyone, Paul Bertorelli reporting for AvWeb from AirVenture 2021. You might remember that 3 years ago we reported on this aircraft, the Opener Blackfly. Might not be the most inspiring name for a new flying machine, but here at Oshkosh in 2021 they actually flew the thing for a couple of demos. I'm ready to try it myself. They're actually building it in volume, and if it doesn't somehow run afoul of the ultralight regulations, you'll be able to buy and fly one yourself. Let's have Marcus Lang explain how that's going to work.
This is our production version, and we came out with this 3 years ago, and what we've been doing in the last 3 years, when COVID hasn't been affecting our operations, is to focus on manufacturing. Building prototypes and flying prototypes is relatively easy. Developing the manufacturing infrastructure to do mass production is very, very difficult. And we began wing manufacturing assembly line back in Christmas of last year, and they've been coming off the line one per day. So we've accumulated
one a day.
An inventory of those. Our fuselage assembly line started up about a little bit over a month and a half ago, and it's producing fuselages at one per week, and we hope to significantly accelerate that towards the end of August. As an ultralight, there's no FAA certification required, but we have a very strict safety review board that consists of all the senior managers at Opener, plus Ed Lu, very famous astronaut, spent 6 months in the space station, also sits on the safety review board for SpaceX and for NASA's manned flight operations. And we also have Alan Eustace, former senior vice president at Google for knowledge. Also holds the world record for the highest parachute jump at, I think, 135,000 plus feet. And we required unanimous approval from the board to allow manned flight, and that approval was gotten about 3 weeks ago. We're going to be looking at a sales event this fall, and when we have the sales event, we're going to have sufficient aircraft to back up those sales so that a customer can purchase the vehicle, come in for their training, which is approximately 2 days, and we'll guide them through their first flights, and then they can take their aircraft and go fly. The price has not been finalized at this point, but will be in the next month to 2 months. Training takes about 2 days. The easy part is actually learning to fly the aircraft. That just takes minutes. But we have to go through all the safety training that's required, and we have to ensure that potentially there will be non-pilots who will be purchasing this aircraft. And as an ultralight, you don't need any formal pilot licenses or license. And we have to ensure that those individuals are brought up to the same level of standard of understanding the regulations as to what they can do, what they can't do, and they also need to understand the aircraft, how it's built, how it's designed, and all the different features of it, so that they can deal with all circumstances that may arise. We did 2 flights with 2 different aircraft. The first flight was done by Eleanor, and Eleanor Lee is the manufacturing manager for Opener, and she did what we call a demo flight. So what this allows a customer to do is, for their first flight, is to, after training, to sit in the aircraft and basically sit back and experience what it's like to do a takeoff, a cruise flight, turn around, come back, and diagonal landing. without actually requiring any input from the operator. I did the second flight, and I demonstrated the VTOL capability of the aircraft, the pure VTOL. So the aircraft rotated and ascended directly vertically, and then I descended again, demonstrated the sideways flying capability of the aircraft, its rotating capability, forward flight, and then finally I did a return to home. And that allows me then to sit back, relax, and watch the aircraft come back to the takeoff location and takeoff orientation.
That is so cool.
The vehicle currently is designed to carry a 200-pound payload, VTOL takeoff, VTOL landing, 25 miles, and to have a 20% reserve.
That's impressive. This is so awesome.
That thing sounds so cool. That is so cool.
Button next button replay seek slider 6 button flip seek sliders button next left parent button replay button next button mute left parent clickable 6 button next left parent button replay seek slider button replay S main landmark graphic clickable channel watermark clickable top 19 click up 7 heading link clickable complete
All right,
dialog
let me fix this.
clickable button action menu clickable heading level 3 link Oshkosh link clickable link experimental aircraft
Machine it.
link go to check clickable land clickable Oshkosh 2021 open button subscribe to Mike Patey
Physics, math, and
clickable not
engineering.
clickable button notif dialog
Machine it, draft it, build.
Come on.
banner landmark clickable button skip navigate search 9 click main land seek button next
Hey
button pause
everyone, Paul
That is so
air
cool,
vent clickable
huh?
Scrappy flies to Oshkosh bar Scrappy number 61 heading level 3 visit clickable runaway aircraft this aircraft flew 2 hours without controls heading level 3 link clickable mentor pilot
This 2 hour without controls?
link clickable verified link heading level 3 runaway aircraft this aircraft clickable Airbus Vahana and a comparison with the black clickable runaway aircraft this aircraft
I
flew 2
gotta,
hours
let's watch this, guys, then we'll get back on topic here. I gotta see this.
visited
Picture the craziest,
clickable complimentary banner
wildest
main menu link
rollercoaster
graphic
ride in the
button pause
entire
button
world.
next button pause left parent K right parent
And now
button next
imagine
left
yourself being
parent shift
stuck
plus
on
N
that
button
ride against your will
Seek
for
sliders
close
button,
to
pause
2
left.
hours. That's what happened to the crew and passengers of this Embraer 190. And how that could happen and how the story actually ended is what I'm going to cover in this
All right.
video. So stay
This
tuned.
guy got some pretty good stories. Let's see what happens.
A huge thank you to Manscaped for sponsoring this video. The disturbing story of Air Astana flight 1388 actually started about a month prior to the accident flight, where the operator, Air Astana, had flown the Embraer 190/100LR into a maintenance base in Portugal called Alverca do Ribatejo. In there, they had contracted a Portuguese maintenance firm called OGMA, that's Industria Aeronáutico de Portugal, to actually do the maintenance check. And this is not unusual when airlines don't have their own maintenance organizations, they contract in external organizations. So that happens quite a lot. The aircraft was scheduled to do some quite heavy maintenance. It included a normal C2 check, which is kind of a reoccurring check that the aircraft has to go through at a certain number of cycles or hours. But it also included a couple of service bulletins. Now, service bulletins is when the aircraft manufacturer sends out an instruction to the airlines to upgrade their aircraft. And in this case, they needed to upgrade part
know, that's
of
cool,
the
isn't it, Andy?
routing of
That's
the
cool.
cables that led to the ailerons, but they also needed to change the aileron cables completely
Man,
from stainless steel cables
I want
to
more than
carbon
one to
steel
ride in one. I
cables.
want to own
And
one
that
of them
meant that
things.
the
I
maintenance
would-
personnel would have to completely
Man, I'd
remove
save
the
up
old
for one of
cables
them.
in order to fit the new ones. The maintenance work was supposed to take about half a month to complete, but the workers ran into some complications. Because when they started to try to replace the aileron cables, they found the instructions quite hard to read. They found them very, very confusing, and there was a lack of graphic material to show exactly how the cables were supposed to be connected. So the work took a little bit longer than expected. And once they had completed the work, they had to test it. This is something that you obviously have to do after any type of heavy maintenance to make sure that you haven't done something wrong. But when they powered the aircraft up, they received an ACAS message that said, "Flight controls, no dispatch." This is obviously an ominous sign when you've been working with the flight controls and you get this. So the engineers and the mechanics now started to troubleshoot this issue, and they did several systems tests, both of the flight control modules, which is part of the computer system of the Embraer, and also the actual physical connections. But even though they did all of these tests, it seems like no one actually checked what the ailerons were doing when the yoke was moved in the cockpit. Before we continue, it's really important that you guys understand how an aircraft moves along its roll axis. There are basically two different systems that controls this. You have the ailerons, which are the rudders that are situated on the outermost part of the wing. They tend to move upwards on the part of the wing that is going down and downwards on the other. So that forces the aircraft to roll. But there's another system as well, and that's the flight spoilers. So the way that flight spoilers works is that when you tell the aircraft to turn one wing down, well then these spoilers will come up on that wing. Will actually, as the name suggests, spoil the lift on that wing, which will make the aircraft roll. And these two systems, they work together to achieve the same thing, where one will work a little bit more in the lower speed and another one will work a little bit more in the higher speed regime.
Button next left button pause left parent. K right parent.
Something that's going to become really important in this
Button next
story
left.
is the fact that the Embraer 190 is kind of like a hybrid aircraft in that some of the flight controls are fly-by-wire, which means that the pilot does something in the cockpit and that's then changed into electronic signals that goes out to an activation unit by that rudder. The flight spoilers are fly-by-wire. But it's also conventional kind of wires connected to the flight controls in the case of the ailerons. So you have two systems that's working together here. As the maintenance dragged on, the pressure on the maintenance organization to get the job done became bigger and bigger. So they started reaching out to Embraer to get some help on this flight control no dispatch issue. And eventually, by switching out some flight control modules in the kind of guidance computer, they managed to clear the message. Okay, the message did not come back. So that meant that the aircraft was now ready to be given back to the customer so that they could fly it back to their home base. On the 11th of October 2018, the pilots who were supposed to fly Air Astana Flight 1388 reported to the airfield. The flight was expected to go from Portugal to Minsk in Belarus initially for a refueling stop and then proceed towards Almaty in Kazakhstan. Now, the crew that had been scheduled to do this flight was a normal flight crew, and I say that because generally speaking, after heavy maintenance, most airlines tend to have pilots that are specifically trained to do acceptance flights. But Air Astana didn't do it that way. It was just a normal flight crew that consisted of 3 pilots. The captain was 40 years old and had 6,009 hours of total time. And together with him was a first officer who was 32 years old and had 2,692 hours of total time.
That's good
The
flying
third
time.
pilot in the cockpit was actually a slightly more experienced first officer. He was 26 years old and had 3,514 hours. And the role of this third pilot is actually going to become really important as this proceeds. On board the flight there was also 3 passengers and all 3 of them worked for Air Astana, mainly in maintenance roles. When the pilots and the passengers arrived to the aircrafts, the weather outside was really bad. Right? It was visibility varying between 2,000 meters and 3,000 meters in heavy rain. It was low clouds, and that's pretty important because when we do acceptance flights after heavy maintenance, especially if there's been maintenance done on the flight controls, you want to have fairly good weather. The reason for that is that you want to be able to, in case something goes wrong, stay in visual meteorological conditions so that you can easily do a visual return back to the airport of departure. But this was definitely not the case on this day. The crew now started to do their pre-flight setup, and they almost immediately recognized that there was one problem with the ventilation to one of the avionics bays, and one of the hydraulic systems was also at a fairly low quantity level. So they called the engineering team back and they said, we're not going to accept the aircraft like this. Got off the aircraft, the maintenance team sorted these things out, and 2 hours later the aircraft was finally ready for departure. When the crew came back for the second time, they started again to set the aircraft up. Now this time they'd received no warnings, and they started the aircraft up and started taxiing out for departure runway 04. During the taxi out, the crew did their pre-flight checks, and that includes a check of the rudder surfaces. On the Embraer 190, the way that you check your flight controls is that as you're moving the yoke around, you're also supposed to verify that the rudder surfaces are moving correctly on a screen. There seemed to have been something missed here, because if the pilots would have looked down on the screen, they would have seen a really, really strange indication. And that would have been as they moved the aileron to turn left, what they should have seen was the aileron coming up on the left-hand side. But in this case, it actually went down and it came up on the right-hand side. However, the flight spoilers were moving the way they should. At time 13:30, Air Astana flight 1338 took off runway 04 in Alverca, and the first 30 seconds seems to have been fairly normal. But after that, as the pilot flying, which was the captain in this case, tried to engage the autopilot would not engage. And he started noticing, as he was flying the aircraft manually, that he had almost no control of the aircraft. And you can imagine why, because as he was trying to turn the aircraft, for example, to the left, you would have had the aircraft wanting to turn to the right using the ailerons and to the left using the flight spoilers. This renders the aircraft completely unflyable. And within a minute, they called the first Mayday call into Alverca Tower. And that coincided with the first real upset of the flight.
I had a problem with that maintenance crew, period.
Many more to come. What is about to happen to this flight crew and these passengers are among the most terrifying things that I've ever read from a flight data recorder. As they're now trying to control the aircraft and they're calling to air traffic control with a Mayday call, the aircraft goes from plus 20,000 feet per minute to minus 16,000 feet per minute, with G loads of plus 4.5 Gs to minus half a G. These are immense forces that are being put on the airframe, and the aircraft is turning over completely inverted. And I can just try to imagine the feeling of the pilots who's trying to deal with an upset the way that they have been taught and learned in the simulator and from when they started flying. Now the flight controls are doing the complete opposite and sometimes completely inexplicable things. And on top of that, they don't get any fault indications. They don't get any warnings except for the ground proximity warning system and the bank angle warnings and everything else screaming at them. But there's nothing from what they can see on their instrumentation that explains to them why this is happening. They're going to have to try to figure that out by themselves. There are air traffic control recordings that are being saved from this flight, and once again I'm going to link to Aviation's great video on this in the description of the video. But it's really heart-wrenching to hear, because the first few calls that you can hear from them, the crew is just asking to please get radar vectors out towards the sea so that they can ditch the aircraft and try to increase their own chances of survival, but most of all to try to avoid third-party casualties on the ground. And every time air traffic control give them a vector, you can see on the radar screen how the aircraft is turning the completely wrong way. It's not doing at all what they wanted to do. This situation, where the aircraft went through these cycles of extreme climbs and descents and rolls and G-loadings, continued for more than 1 hour. I get sick just by looking at the graph of what these guys went through, and I just cannot imagine how the feeling would have been in the cockpit as this was happening. But one thing that I really want to emphasize here, and that really impressed me, was that these guys never stopped troubleshooting. Okay, they never gave up. They continued to try to figure out how to A, control the aircraft, aviate, right? Get the aircraft under control. Because in between these extremes, they actually managed to level the aircraft off, which meant that they could kind of by trial and error figure out what to do to keep the aircraft more or less level. And not only that, they were also working and communicating really well between each other. Because remember how I said that the third pilot, the guy that was sitting on the jump seat, was going to be really important for the outcome? Well, throughout these extreme maneuvers, he keeps giving advice, technical advice, and shows really good technical knowledge of the aircraft to the captain. And he also works as a relay between the cockpit and the passenger sitting in the back. So to try to figure out why the aircraft is doing this. And after a little while, they start to realize that, this seems to be the ailerons that are the problem. And they start this troubleshooting really early during the flight. Only about a minute after the first indication of the flight control problems, we can see from the flight data recorder that the crew switches from normal law to direct law. And what that means in the Embraer is that in normal mode, the inputs from the pilots goes through a flight control computer, a flight control module, and it feels the configuration of the aircraft, the speed of the aircraft, and it modulates the outputs to the actual flight control surfaces. But if you go to direct law, then the input from the flight controls is directly translated to the flight control surfaces. And the benefit here seems to have been that in direct law, when the pilots put aileron input in, there seems to have been a little bit of a dead band, where only the ailerons were activated, not the flight spoilers. And even though the ailerons were now moving the opposite way, it was still far, far better that only the ailerons were moving than having opposite activation of ailerons and flight spoilers, because with that, the aircraft cannot be controlled. So in direct law, the crew eventually figured out that if they do teeny tiny inputs on aileron,
Their channels.
then if you turn right, the aircraft is going to kind of bank to the left, but at least it does that continuously. But if you put a little bit too much, all of a sudden
Studio
you
and
lose control of the aircraft.
Lockheed Martin registered
They
group
managed to
R3.
figure this out
Time en route to
after about an
destination,
hour
4
and
hours 48
15
minutes.
And when
Pause.
they
Sound.
figured this out,
Runway
they were
aircraft.
also
This aircraft flew 2 hours
intercepted by
without
two
controls. Dash U2, dash on.
F-16 fighters from the Portuguese
Runway
Air
aircraft.
Force. And that came with some additional problems for the crew. I'll tell you all about what happened with that and how this terrifying flight concluded after this message from my new sponsor. I'm so happy to have
Button mute,
Manscaped
button next left,
as
button
the
pause left
sponsor
parent,
of this
seek slide.
video. Manscaped trimmer.
Chapter 11,
device,
chapter,
skin's
chapter 11,
waterproof,
call.
which means you can use
Chapter,
and some ball
chapter,
top
chapter 11,
for a whopping 20
chapter 12,
hour and 15
chapter 12.
minutes. The crew have now started to get
Pause
the
left.
aircraft under some sort of control. They've also realized that if they keep the flaps at 1, that gives about 7 degrees of trailing edge flaps and 15 degrees of slats. It actually gives them a little bit more maneuver margin. Now, it is a bit risky to have the flaps extended when you know that the aircraft is going to be subjected to these type of G-loadings, but it is obviously much more preferable to have the aircraft under control and potentially damage it than it is to lose control completely. They are now maneuvering and trying to follow air traffic control's radar vectors that are vectoring down towards the south, because down in the south in Portugal on this day, the weather was significantly better. Remember, they departed into some really poor weather, and that definitely didn't help them when they were trying to sort things out. Now, as they're getting into more clear weather, it's becoming much easier. But at the same time, the Portuguese air defense have sent out 2 F-16 fighters to try to intercept the crew and help them to navigate. The problem though is that as these 2 F-16s are approaching the aircraft, they forget to turn off their TCAS, which means that the crew is now sitting there with full-on TCAS warnings as well. So you can hear on the air traffic control recording how they're telling them to please turn off the TCAS. From this point onwards, it's less about the crew wanting to ditch the aircraft and more about actually finding a suitable alternate to try to land the aircraft at. Initially, they're thinking about diverting towards Faro, which is down south in Portugal, where the weather is better, but then air traffic control suggested them to go to an air defense base called Beja. And that's much closer, so the crew starts to descend with the help of the fighter jet down towards Beja. And they decide that they're going to try to fly a visual approach into runway 19 right, which is the main runway in Beja. Said and done, the captain now starts aiming towards the runway. You can see from the flight readouts how they're never really stabilized. They're constantly moving left to right on the center line. And as they get closer, it becomes really apparent that he is not going to be able to stabilize the approach. So he's now going to have to go around with this flight control condition. After that first go around, the first officer is so physically exhausted from the ordeal that they've just gone through that he just cannot continue. So the captain, who must be some kind of Superman, exchanges the first officer for the first officer that was sitting on the jump seat. So he now jumps in and they go in for a second visual approach. The same thing happens. They destabilize at the late part of the approach and they have to go around for a second time. On the third approach, the crew is still not able to get the aircraft in on the center line for runway 19 right. But this time, when the aircraft starts to drift towards the left, the captain just realizes that they have runway 19 left there, which is slightly narrower, but he thinks that he will be able to get the aircraft down on that runway. So he points at it, and at time 15:27, almost 2 hours after their initial takeoff, the aircraft lands safely on runway 19 left in Beja.
Oh
as
my
soon as
gosh.
the aircraft
I
comes to
thought-
complete
Next button,
stop.
pause. Play left
I don't
parent.
know about
K
you
right.
guys, but I thought that he was going to end this with them saying that they died, crashed. I say maintenance is fully responsible for that whole ordeal. They just kept on having error after error anyways, and that's, right there's your red flag. And sometimes I think these red flags get ignored. And, when I went to South Carolina, the first time I flew, and this was with American Airlines, and I'm sorry, American Airlines, but I'm not going to give you no positive hashtag Go American Airlines, because I'm not happy with that company at all. I've got over 15,000 air miles, but what am I going to do with it? All right. Anyway, first flight was great, and I started getting really comfortable again with flying. Now, even though I like to fly in the sim and all that, being in the cockpit, if I had that option, that's one thing. But being in the back and just sitting there, and someone else is in full control, you have no control. Whatever. Anyway. Right when I get used to flying and I more comfortable, we're getting ready to land. We're coming in to start our approach. Well, we was on approach for Louisville. All of a sudden I smell this burning smell. We're still at 14,000 feet. And I can smell it. And it smells like wires burning or plastic burning. Well, next thing I know, we went from being at 13,000 feet to where the pilot, there was no hesitation on what he was going to do. He put us on the ground, got us at the edge of the runways there at Louisville. We was 2 miles from the gate. That's how far out we was. Louisville's got a lot of runways, and they go out pretty far. But we sit out there. This was altogether, let's see, about 6.5, 7 hour deal. We sit out there for over 4 hours on the runway. And then another 2.5 hours when we got inside. Because when we got off the plane, they just had to open the door and use, the ladder that they can bring up to the planes. How the truck will bring a ladder and put up there. And that's what we all exited on, was the ladder. And it's basically just a big platform with, well, it's a ladder, yeah. Anyway, come to find out, it was one of the air packs failed. Well, I did some research, and it wasn't the first time that an air pack failed coming from Charlotte on a Bombardier airplane, which tells me maintenance wasn't checking them, or they was, and they just didn't see nothing that was any major deal. And I understand sometimes things can happen with no matter how many times you check it. But either way. Okay, so here's what we're going to do. One last time, if you're listening, if you want a free flight stick and throttle, you're going to need to answer that question. Send me an email, info@standpodcast.com. What year was the 747 released to fly? All right, get that to me, and
Lockheed Martin Ops 27 Ops 20.
I'll be contacting you.
Stop record. Stop.
If no one answered it today,
Scene transition.
well,
Control. Stop recording.
we'll do it on another live stream.
Stop streaming. Checkbox checked.
All right, guys, I'm out here. Shout out to all my friends, Andy and everybody on Facebook.
Stop. Stop. Scene transitions. Controls window. Stop streaming. Checkbox checked.
We'll talk to you guys later on. Be sure to give us a thumbs up. Listen, if you can help share this, that does help. So help share the channel, whether you're on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, whatever social sites that you might be a part of that you use every day. Click on that share button. Share the channel. Share the channel. Okay? It really will help out a lot.
Stop. Stop streaming.
Till next time, I am Rowdy Bowdy Addy. Y'all have a good day, a good night. And,